Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Hadeil Ali and I'm the Director of the Diversity and Leadership in International Affairs Project. It is my pleasure to host today's conversation on disability inclusion in foreign policy. I am especially honored to welcome Sara Minkara, Special Advisor on International Disability Rights at the U.S. Department of State. Special Advisor Minkara is a long-standing champion for disability inclusion and accessibility both inside and outside of government. Sara and I will discuss the inaugural International Disability Rights Playbook, opportunities and challenges in integrating disability inclusion into policy, and its implications for global security and peace building. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Special Advisor Minkara, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's extremely busy for you. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us today.
Well, I'm happy and honored to be here with you, Hadeil, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Special Advisor Minkara, I always like to ask people before getting into their work, the lens with which they approach what we're doing. And I want to ask you to share with us your experiences as a Muslim woman with a disability, not to mention your entrepreneurial background. Yeah. How has that shaped your approach to your role as Special Advisor?
It's a really good question. I mean, as a Muslim woman, as an Arab American woman, as a person with a disability, as a blind person, and as you said, as an entrepreneur, I hold so many labels, and some that are visible that we mentioned and some that are non-visible. But these labels, these identities, these experiences really help shape my approach to diplomacy, my approach in building connections and relationships, my approach in terms of how I understood the importance of engaging civil society organizations on the ground and their perspective, because I used to have a civil society organizations, or my experience as a Muslim woman connecting with the Muslim world, or as an Arab American woman. I think all of these different identities and experiences help me shape my diplomacy efforts, help me build those relationships, and help me kind of really then design and develop policies that can really transform change around disability inclusion.
Absolutely. And as the U.S. Special Advisor on International Disability Rights, can you talk to us about what did a comprehensive strategy for promoting and protecting the rights of persons of disabilities look like? What did it entail?
So if we take a step back and we think about it, if I ask anyone about disability inclusion in foreign policy, right? People will focus just on the fact that there's social protection that needs to be done. It's a human rights issue. Let's ensure people with disabilities' rights are protected. And yes, our rights need to be protected, promoted, advanced. But also, we are people that can contribute to the economy. We are people that can impact our GDP by 7%. We're people that can innovate. We are people that need to be at the table when we're talking about designing AI. We are people that should be part of the security conversation and peace-building conversation. And I think this is where we're left out of most of the spaces because we're only seen through let's take care of you lens. We need to disrupt that, shift that, and say, you know what, the 1.3 billion individuals in this world need to be part of every single policy sectoral conversation, every single dialogue, discussion, and need to be at the table, not just on disability-related issues.
And you've talked about this, Sara, disrupting the narrative and assumptions that people make about integrating this work into, like you said, between quotations, soft power issues, soft security issues. It's the human rights, labor issues, but it's also conversations around economic security and AI and hard security issues, just like you just talked about. Yeah,
and you have world right now, countries talking about digitizing their government services or developing a digital economic framework or whatever it is, and most of the time the disability lens is left out of the conversation. We need to disrupt that part.
And you've taken many trips during your time as a special advisor. Is that something that you noticed often during your trips, during your engagements, assumptions about who you should meet with and what conversations you should be having versus the ones that you wanted to have as well?
Definitely. I've been to over 50 countries in these past 3 years, and I think it's been an amazing journey. where, you know, I learned a lot. But the thing that what you're mentioning is whenever we would go on a trip and our embassy would put together a schedule and they would recommend you should meet with the Minister of Social Affairs, Labor, Education, and Health, right? Because that's where typically the disability lens is positioned. We would go back and say, I want to meet with the Minister of Trade. I want to meet with the Minister of Commerce or digital economy, whatever it is. And they say, oh, why? I say, well, this is where we need to have disability in these spaces. I don't want to just meet with the private sectors that are doing a good job on inclusive employment. I want to meet with the private sector that are not thinking about this. I don't just want to, which we should, meet with the organization of persons with disabilities to hear their voice and perspective, but I want to meet with civil society that are not thinking about us. So we kind of started shifting and saying, let's meet with folks that are not really thinking about the disability lens.
It's definitely a culture change in the way we think about this issue.
And even within our embassies, I mean, this goes back to how do we ensure our embassy, from the ambassador, DCM, and all sections have a disability lens?
Right. One of those trips that you took was to Italy for the first G7 Ministerial on Inclusion and Disability. Talk to us about the work leading up to that trip, the takeaways from those conversations, but also where would you like to see that conversation going from there? So
this goes back to kind of a few years ago when Germany had the presidency for G7. The Commissioner of Disability, Jorgen, organized a G7 Disability Summit, which was great. But then we said, let's take it a step further and let's make sure that the disability dialogue is at a ministerial level and it's in the political track. Let's make sure that it's a G7 disability ministerial meeting. And that's where I had a conversation with Minister Locatelli from Italy. She loved that idea and took it forward and worked with her prime minister and her leadership to make sure there was the first ever G7 disability ministerial meeting. Amazing impact, amazing progress. It put disability on the political landscape, but there's more work to be done. Right. And the work to be done is two layers. One is how do we continue this G7 to move forward, whether with Canada this year or France the next year, and France that commits. So how do we make that continue moving forward? But also second is how do we ensure then the people that are coming to the G7 disability ministerial meeting, they're not just folks that know about this disability. There are folks that are not thinking about disability and they come and they learn and they connect and they engage. So how do we become more intentional? Who do we bring on the delegations? Who do we invite as speakers? Who do we invite as an audience to make sure that we are breaking out of our silos?
Yeah. And so it's already a lot of progress, like you said, but there's more work to be done. Yes. So you already talked about many of the accomplishments that your office has had. And another one I want to highlight, which is the International Disability Rights Playbook that was announced back in November. Yes. Talk to us about what drove you and your team to create this tool, and what were you hoping to accomplish with it?
So, as I was saying earlier, how when we used to go on these trips and our embassies would organize the schedule is very much pigeonholed within the sectors that are thinking about disability. And then we would come back and say, let's actually meet with this ministry or this minister or whatever it is. But then we saw an amazing example where when we went to Embassy Lima, we went to Peru, Ambassador Lisa Kenna, who was ambassador at the time, mobilized the entire embassy to work on a trip. So every single section, every single, and we saw what it took for a whole embassy to take disability forward. And we said, wow, this is an amazing example for us to take forward. So from that point on, we worked with Embassy Lima to develop a disability foreign policy playbook that illustrates how every single section, every single policy officer should be taking disability forward, from the ambassador, DCM, to all the different sections, but also our bureaus and offices, because disability we need to create shared responsibility. We need to have people carry this work forward, but then we need to show them how. So this playbook kind of is the first step of showing how. So it's a toolkit so people can really carry this work forward with us.
Yeah. And how have you seen the response to the tool so far?
It's been amazing. And we've heard so many feedback from our embassies all over the world saying, we need this, we needed this. This helped us think through how disability is part of our economic section or our, political section, whatever it is, right? It really helped people because a lot of people want to take this work forward. We've developed an external version on the playbook, which is on our State Department website, but we're hoping that this can continue forward where we, one, collect and share best, good, and promising practices from all over the world, because there's something that we need to keep learning from each other. But two, also create a thematic toolkit playbook where we have a section on AI or a section on trade or a section on climate action so people can carry those work forward in the different dialogues that happen all over the world.
Yeah. And it's not just for the U.S. Department of State, right? It's also for any of the other industries to think about this work. And I think your point about the thematic piece of it is important as well.
Yeah. And what we've learned is sometimes you just have to have the conversation where people are like, oh, I've never thought about taking disability forward. And then they say, how do we do that? And then we say, here you go. Let's work together, right? Like we just need to start the conversation and start kind of building capacity.
Yeah. I think for me, a key takeaway from what you were saying, Sara, about the example in Peru is leadership as well. It takes a leader who's prioritizing this issue, who's mobilizing their staff, their team to think about this seriously and drive this work.
It makes a huge difference from when leadership takes this forward. And, I'm forever grateful for Ambassador Lisa Kenna for being a partner in this, and the embassy as well. But this goes back to, we need to do disability inclusion bottom up, but also top down. And this is where, when we've met with I'll give you an example, when we met with the digital minister of Malaysia earlier in July, and we had an amazing conversation. Then he said, I'm going to take this back to my team. He took it back to his team. His team did work and research, came back and said, this is how we're going to take disability digital inclusion forward. The fact that he took it forward and said to his team, that makes a huge difference. So we need to keep engaging on all levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you found that leveraging data in your conversations to talk about the cost of exclusion to our economies, to our democracies? I'm sure it's a combination of different strategies, storytelling, using data. Have you found that it's all of those strategies combined?
It's such an amazing question. And to be honest, we need more data on disability. We lack so much data and research on disability. On one hand, and this is something that someone powerful from the international development community said, people who are not counted do not count, right? And to be honest, the disability community, most of the time, our stories, our experiences are not counted across the board, especially in moments of crisis. So we need to keep pushing on disaggregated data on disability across the board, because to show the reality in the landscape and to show to really illustrate what is the current status of people with disabilities. On the other hand, we need to start showcasing and sharing the stories of value that we do bring forward to the world. People don't know text messaging came from the deaf community's need, right? People don't know a lot of how we've contributed. Also, there needs to be more research, and there's some out there, but research around when people with disabilities are excluded, it hurts the economy, but when we're included, it benefits everyone and helps the bottom line. We need more of that shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And your important point about it helps all of us ultimately. We've talked about many of the accomplishments that you and your team have done, but also I'm sure there are many others that we have not talked about. But I can imagine that were also challenges along the way, and I would love to hear from you some of the challenges or lessons that you've taken away in terms of this work, and how do we integrate it into U.S. government, but also beyond.
Yeah, I think the challenge on one level is that we're such a double-edged sword. And what do I mean by that? On one hand, if you ever come to someone and say, hey, let's work on disability, no one will ever tell you no, right? They'll look like a jerk if they say no.
And they have to.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, we're either an invisible population to people. People don't understand the systemic many layers of barriers that we face. People see us from a charity lens, so the narrative is what really hurts us, that still exists. And I think this is where one of the main things that we need to keep doing is disrupting the narrative in society across the board, because until society demands our inclusion, we're never going to reach full disability inclusion. So we need to engage in the trade industry more. We need to engage the media sector more. We need to really disrupt the narrative and have the difficult conversation, because you know what? I do want people, and there are some people, a lot of people will have some of these thoughts. You're special needs, you're costly, you're different, you're an add-on. We need to have those conversations. Until we have them and address them, we're never going to reach full inclusion.
Yeah. Sara, have you found that also at times people want to limit the conversation from a HR perspective
Yes.
or a
Yes.
workforce perspective,
Yes.
which is an important conversation, but I think it also limits our ability to have it from a policy perspective, like we've been talking about,
Yeah.
because it's about disability inclusion to foreign policy, national security, economic security, and so on.
Yeah, people really, and that's their comfort zone. They really want to focus it on the human resources layer, and it's really fascinating, because that's what they people need something tangible that to really engage with. So, but whereas we need to push and say, hey, we're not here to focus on the internal HR employment. We're here to talk about how disability policy can impact our peace building process or security. And people cannot imagine what that means. And I think that's where it's like, they're like, okay, well, what do you mean? One time I talked to someone about, hey, let's make sure there's a disability, peace, and security strategy within NATO. They're like, what does that really mean? I was like, well, have you seen the Women, Peace, and Security strategy? You know, tell me like people cannot sometimes conceptualize what that means. Right. And I think that's the hard part until they see more examples, concrete examples, and stories. And that's why I was like, stories are really important.
Yeah, and I'm sure this will resonate with you. Yeah. You've seen an agenda of a conference or a meeting, right? And at the very end, there's going to be a session on DI, right, or disability inclusion. Yeah. Rather than thinking about there's a standalone topic, but how do you integrate it into the agenda of any conference? It's not just the disability inclusion conference. It's any conference that's happening. How is it integrated into the work? And I think at times people, exactly like you said, have a hard time conceptualizing. How do you do that?
Exactly. It's on one hand what you said, it's how do we make sure we are intentionally and mainstreaming, but not from a technical where it's like a plus disability kind of thing, but really mainstreaming throughout our efforts, conversations, and policymaking, which is really hard for people to visualize. And on the other hand, how do we really help the disability community break out of and connect with the right spaces, right? I will say in any of our disability conferences, I say who should be in the audience that's not in the audience, and also what space. I want you to target a space that you think disability should be part of that's not thinking about us, right? So I think it's on both ends. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Sara, you've talked in many cases about how this community is impacted by climate change, conflict. Yeah. Talk to us about also how you've been able to convey that story of how the community is impacted by, again, conflict, climate change, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, even with our current status of wildfires, for instance, in the U.S., right? Like, whenever there's a crisis, whether it's conflict or climate crisis that hits, our communication is not always accessible to the disability community. Evacuation it's not accessible. Imagining you are in a place where they're telling you to evacuate within a few hours, and there's no accessible way to evacuate as a wheelchair user or as a blind father or whatever it is. How are you going to evacuate? Bomb shelters not being accessible, humanitarian aid not reaching you because you're not able to leave your home because of your disability. There's so many layers of vulnerability, and I say the vulnerability because the systems at place is not thinking about our needs. Crisis, you know what people disability say? We are an acceptable loss during moments of crisis. And that's how we feel, and we need to change that. People will say, well, Sara, we do have a disability policy in our humanitarian efforts. That's not enough. I want to actually understand what are the gaps. Because you know what? When you talk to the disability community during crisis, there's huge gaps still.
Yeah, absolutely. Sara, when you look back at your 4 years in this role, what if you had to pick one major takeaway from all the work that you and your team led, what would it be?
I would say that disability is an amazing diplomacy tool. It opens up doors in more ways than we can ever imagine. And people want to work with us on this issue. I won't forget how our amazing meetings that we had in Turkmenistan, or the meetings that we had in Cuba, or our U.S.-China coordination meeting in Beijing. Like people want to work on disability. And I think it's so beautiful, and for me, that will forever be an important message for the world. Is we're amazing, and disability is an amazing diplomacy tool, but then also we're amazing diplomats. And I think people don't underestimate how much, as a blind diplomat, for instance, when I enter a space, because I can't read off of a script, I end up becoming more my true self, and then that person in front of them becomes more of their true self, and we have an amazing constructive conversation. And that's because, for my accessibility needs, it forced the conversation to be more open and authentic. I think there's a power to people's disability and diplomacy that we're not really utilizing.
We're not leveraging and tapping into.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you found, Sara, that sometimes what's stopping people from engaging with this work, sometimes I hear about that, right? I don't know what language to use. I don't know if I'm going to say the wrong thing. Yeah. How do we get people to get over that hurdle and really engage? Because I see this in the broader work around racial equity or conversations around inclusion. I don't know how to engage. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to get in trouble for the language that I'm using.
It's a really good question. I would say we need to just approach any interaction from a point of curiosity through a lens of compassion instead of assumption. So I'm fine if someone comes and asks me what's the right term? Should I say handicap, special needs, special abilities, differently able, disability? But just ask. Be curious. But don't be curious through a lens of assumption. And it's really awful when someone does come and is assuming things. Just be curious. And I think curiosity is a really powerful, amazing thing that we should keep using, so I can learn more about you and ourselves. And I agree, so many people are afraid of offending. We're not offended if you're coming at it from a curiosity lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you put that. So I want us to look forward, and look into the future here. What are your hopes to see from both policymakers that work on disability inclusion, but I think it's also everyone that works in the policymaking space? What do you hope to see from this network, from this ecosystem, on how to move this work forward in the next 5 to 10 years?
I hope that policy schools are producing graduating policymakers are thinking about disability, not just disability experts, but bringing disability across all of their policy making. So when a student comes into the State Department or any other foreign ministry, disability is already part of their framework or their thought process. My dream is that every single office and bureau in any foreign ministry has a disability policy lens. My dream is that in these big conferences, whether it's the Munich Security Conference or NATO conferences or whatever it is, have a disability lens. And again, not just from a HR or diversity inclusion, but more from this is an important foreign policy across all of our efforts. But ultimately, it's where leaders of our countries, where the Secretary of State or the President, whatever it is, brings up disability. Again, not just from an add-on, but here it is part of, understanding it as an important lens of foreign policy.
Yeah. And I love the point that you made about starting in schools, right? It's also, you think about back to undergrad or college or grad school. What are you being taught? Yeah. Because that also signals to us what is valuable, right? What are the courses that are valuable to take? What are you discussing again? And I in the last few years, I think I'm seeing now courses on gender and race or so on. But it's also about, in all courses related to international affairs and foreign policy, how are you integrating that lens? Because again, it's the conscious or subconscious signaling of what's valuable.
Exactly.
So I love that you said that. I know we're almost out of time, so I want you to leave us with just one last question on advice that you have for any of us working on these issues or seeking to be champions, and also to young people who are going to be this next generation of advocates, wanting to make a difference. What would you say to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say one is that don't be afraid to engage. Understand that disability population is 1.3 billion. We're pretty sizable. You know, in the U.S., it's actually 25% of our population. To understand that we should all be in touch in any of our efforts, work efforts, the organizations of persons with disabilities. But also to understand that, you know, this bringing disability inclusion enhances our, you know, work, our progress, our productive, everything, right? It's a benefit. So for me, I would say anyone, please take disability inclusion forward, but don't do it without bringing in the disability community, right? There's a phrase like nothing about us without us. Right. Please don't do it just assuming what the disability community wants and needs.
Absolutely. Well, Special Advisor Minkara, it's been such a pleasure to host you. Thank you immensely for your time, sharing your expertise, for your leadership and service.
Thank you, Hadeil. It was so great being here with you.
Thank you. To our audience online, thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. I hope that this leaves you with a sense of urgency about ways you can find to continue this dialogue and shape ultimately a more inclusive international affairs and foreign policy space for all of us. We look forward to seeing you at future DLIA events. Have a wonderful day.